Okay, so first I want to celebrate a success. You've been working with our founders for a year and a half now on writing thesis statements, and the vast majority of our students wrote a thesis statement that had some structure. So what steps did you take that led to that success? Because I would say they couldn't write a thesis statement when they came to you.
That's true. I think a lot of like practice, and like trying a lot of different methods, and we haven't hit the nail on the head yet, but we've been hitting them with emphasizing the thesis statement and making an argument.
Great. And what specific steps did you take besides practice to teach that?
Trying to like show them examples versus non-examples.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of guided discourses, which has helped, but we're not getting it every time.
That's what we're going to talk about today. But I think that's a success if they understand the structure of a thesis statement in every work sample that I looked at.
Oh, I've also had fill-in-the-blank thesis statements too for structure.
Mm-hmm.
That might
and
help
for
also.
muscle memory, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Kathy does that too in Comp 1. Okay, so today, as you know, we're going to talk about AP Language Learning Objective 4B, which is write a specific thesis statement that requires proof or defense that may preview the structure of the argument. But specifically, I want to talk about the part where you broke down the objective, which is write a defensible thesis statement in response to the prompt.
Yes.
So what I want you to do, I wrote that at the top of this standards breakdown sheet, and I know you've kind of done this thinking step before, but I want to zoom in onto this particular part of the objective. So what do students need to know, do, and show in order to write a defensible thesis statement that responds to the prompt? That's the key there, responds to the prompt.
Okay.
So it takes about 4 minutes to do that. You can do that on this sheet too. Oh, you have this sheet, okay, my bad. I'm trying to read upside down. Sorry, I thought you were writing something else.
I'm also like looking at this to see like, okay, which one's the defensible thesis and what do they do in that?
Alright, go back to I was updating our data tracker. Okay, so talk me through it. What do students need to know?
They need to know how to identify, or they need to know that they need to, I guess, I'm not sure if that's a know or do, but identify the key verbs to find their task for writing, so they need to know that they're looking for like the verbs or the actions that they're being asked to take.
So they need to know when there are verbs, and what they need to do, I would say, is what?
So what they need to do is identify the verbs.
Great.
They need to understand arguments versus factual statements for no, and they also need to know enough about the topic to take a position. And for synthesis, sometimes they've got to like read through in order to do that.
Okay.
For do, they have to take a position. They've got to break down the prompt, and I guess that is what the identifying the key verbs to find their task for writing. In their thesis, they need to enumerate the reasons behind their main claim. So they need to like include why they feel the way they feel. Otherwise, kids mostly like restate the language of the prompt, and they don't like give.
RTQ is coming back to bite us. Yep.
Put their argument into 30 words or less. That's the other tough part. Because there were some thesis statements like Anna's, I think, was like 5 or 6 sentences, and it was a good thesis, but it's like, yeah, too long.
Okay, what do they need to show?
An original argument that tries to persuade, so their own argument.
Great. So the only thing, there's 2 things that I have, that we talked about kind of this morning, I didn't hear you say. One of the things they need to be able to do is paraphrase the prompt in their own words. If you think back to that Art World video we watched a few times about modeling, that's one of the key things he does is write the prompt in their own way. Why is it important for kids to be able to paraphrase the prompt?
Because then they actually understand it, and then that means that they did identify the key verbs if they can.
Right, and then the other thing is, in terms of show, I know you did this digitally, but what would you want to see on the student work?
I would want to see that they're not summarizing somebody else's argument. I would like to see that.
I would add that to your list too.
And that it responds specifically to the prompt. So like if the prompt asks them to.
Great.
Yeah.
And that's a key indicator on the rubric too.
That was where Nija just like so close.
And the last thing I would want to see on a hard copy, and that's why we might have to start doing some of these progress monitoring on hard copies, is like evidence that they've deconstructed the prompt and annotated. So the big thing is like annotations as a whole, but specifically like deconstructing the prompt and then annotating the text.
I 100% agree. That's what I wish we would have done at the AP for All training. We got pictures of deconstructed prompts. I'm like, I just want to watch you teach.
We have that Art World video, so we could watch that again, but we can definitely look into people teaching it and see if anybody has any good strategies. But we're going to talk about that today. So let's keep moving. So out of the kiddo responses I have right here, which student would you say is the exemplar and why? Oh, you have it too. You're the most organized person. I don't ever give people that compliment, so.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
I'm always like, why aren't you more organized? But you're great.
I think Elijah, I would say, hits it on the mark because she says, an apprenticeship is a viable alternative to attending college to a huge extent because it allows people to explore their future careers and still be in college. They're gaining hands-on training and the education.
Great. And so for hers, how does she demonstrate, like, in what ways does she demonstrate the know and do?
Okay, so she responded specifically to the question in the prompt, which asked students to make an argument about, where's the prompt?
The value of apprenticeships,
the extent to which it's a viable alternative to attending college, and she defined the extent and she gave the reasons.
The extent to which, I haven't kept up on those words, keep going.
So she defined the extent and then she gave the reasons why she defined it that way, so that previewed her argument. It's a clear claim, a apprenticeship is a viable alternative. She's not summarizing someone else's argument, and I can tell that she deconstructed the prompt because she's using that exact same, like those keywords without like restating them.
Great. So one of the things I heard you say was that she like clearly provided a preview of the evidence, and we don't have Elijah's paper in front of us, but if you had to guess, what do you think led to her being able to so quickly and clearly identify those?
I'm sure that she went through the sources and she wrote down like.
Perfect. Yep.
These are
great.
The
Annotations when we're going to do uniform. So, and thinking about the students who got a 0 out of a 1 for their thesis, what is the trending gap in the student work?
I'm noticing one that had a 0. There were some surprising zeros. Destin was a surprising 0. Overall, going straight into a vocational school right after secondary education is a good alternative to pursuing college education. It didn't mention apprenticeship. It didn't mention like to what extent it was a good alternative or a viable alternative. It uses like overall, and so it's, I mean, I guess that could be an okay way to start an argument, but it's not as strong as Elijah's, where it's like this is very clearly a claim.
And I would say if you look at Kalia's, which is the first sample, it's kind of the same. She talks more about college and not for or against the extent to which they are for apprenticeships.
Yep.
And so 2 more follow-up questions before we name the gap here. So how have you taught students how to ensure their thesis statements answer the prompt?
I have not deconstructed prompts with students to make, and then like written the thesis statement to the prompt, but we should do that.
Why? You stole my next question. But what, no, that's perfect. That's perfect. This is why you're so smart. It's why is that so important?
It's super important because like Destin can get a great score if he knows to write the correct question. And if students write to the correct question, then they can actually get all of these points. But if they don't, there's just no shot, even if they're working really, really hard and they've got a great essay, but it's not the right argument.
Great. Okay, so fill in the blank for me. Thesis statements did not answer the prompt because
students weren't responding 100% to the prompt using the language of the prompt.
Why? What were they not doing?
They didn't annotate or break down the prompt.
Perfect. Okay, so I have it written down, and there's a spot here on this paper. I give you 1,000 papers, say my bad. But I have the gap statement as thesis statements did not answer the prompt because students do not know how to deconstruct a prompt.
I agree.
Okay, I'm actually going to pull up the art oral video. I wasn't planning to do this, but I think we have some time.
I would love like one day to visit like a class period and observe like maybe even like Clayton or Ladue and just observe an AP Lang teacher. I think that would be really helpful to see. I wrote that down whenever we were looking at our campus goal plan about having beating their EOC scores, and I would like to observe.
We gotta find out who's got good results, and we can totally set that up.
That would be awesome.
I think that's something we could look into, because Jeremy has some data on AP passing grades for different schools. Okay, flip to the back, since there's not a spot on this because I don't normally do this, so we're gonna go straight to the clip of art oral, modeling how to break down a prompt, and I want you to jot down what's effective about how he models how to break down a prompt. It's 2 clips actually. This is like his launch into it. Sorry. And you've seen it before.
What about 3? I noticed some people having a little difficulty with their...
Oh, bad. Gosh darn it. I'm sorry, Mary. Hold on. What did you do there? Great, JK. I think I played video 28. Come on. Perfect. so what's effective about how he breaks down the prompt for kiddos?
We're going to look at an actual AP prompt. One that comes from a topic you should be pretty familiar with. And I'm going to model my thinking for you about how I approach this particular prompt and how I begin to break it down. And what I'd like you to do as I'm going through my thinking for this prompt is to record notes about any of the strategies I use to break down this prompt in a really effective way. So if you notice the key steps I take, any strategies or questions even that I ask myself while I am going through this process, you want to capture it in the space provided. So just so we're really clear, what are you actually doing while I think aloud and I explain my thinking here? Tatiana?
You're taking notes on strategies you're using and basically the thinking that goes along with you breaking that down.
Great. Don't worry so much about my annotations here. I'm going to provide those for you. Focus more on the process and thinking behind the annotations I'm doing. Okay, with that said, let's dive in. So.
Great. How did he effectively launch them into the model?
He's told them that I'm providing you the annotations, so it's not like DeAndre Scott's just trying to actually like copy your paper and not listen. So they're thinking about his thinking about why he's making those annotations. So they know what the annotations look like when they have the paper, but then they also know why he made each specific annotation.
Okay, now let's look at his actual video of the model and what's effective about how he models.
So, the first step I want to do is underline, circle, highlight keywords that will clue me into the time and place of the prompt. So, historians have traditionally labeled the period after the War of 1812 the era of good feelings. So, I see War of 1812, an era of good feelings. That might be pretty important to me. So I see those words and I'm immediately thinking about a time period, a topic and time period. War of 1812, but it says after the War of 1812. So I'm thinking about that period afterwards. And I also know the era of good feelings is 1815 to about 1825. That also matches up with the last part of the prompt, where it says to consider evidence from that period. But the years alone don't really help me. I want to think about what's happening at that time in America. So when I think about the era of good feelings, I immediately start to think about nationalism, through things like the Monroe Doctrine. That's all I can think of right now, so I'm going to keep going. Now, secondly, I want to think about the actual verb. What is it asking me to do? What is it requiring of me here? So I see evaluate the accuracy of this label. Evaluate is my verb. I think back to that chart for breaking down the prompt that we looked at in the do now. And evaluate means to make a judgment. To judge something. Well, what am I actually judging here, I wonder? So I'm going to number them, nationalism and sectionalism, just to remember I have to discuss those somewhere within my essay. Now I want to rewrite it as an actual question to make sure I really understand this. So how can I reword this as a question? Well, I'm judging something. What am I judging? I'm judging whether this label, the era of good feelings, is accurate. Is it true? Was this really an era of good feelings? So I might rewrite it as something like, did the period 1815, to 1825 truly represent an era of good feelings? I've broken down the prompt. The very last thing I want to make sure I do is consider what diagram I might use for this. Well, it's an evaluate prompt. I'm making a judgment. So I want to be able to weigh two sides, see both sides of the argument if I have to evaluate them. A good tool for that is the T-chart. And on one side, I'm trying to decide if this label is accurate or not. Great. We'll pause there. What I'd like you to do right now is turn and talk at your table. What are the steps you pulled out? You could also consider the 3 questions I put there for you at the bottom. Take just 1 minute at your table.
Great. So what's effective about how he modeled how to deconstruct a prompt?
He started with a topic that they were already familiar with, so they weren't like having to learn new content.
Mm-hmm.
They look at the keywords first, and then find like the directions, what it's actually asking them to do. They find the verb, and then he provided for them earlier definitions for all of those verbs that they'll see in prompts, so that they actually know what evaluate means, or whatever verbs I guess you would find in the prompts normally. Then he names how he is using the verb. So he's like, so I've got to actually decide this position because I'm evaluating and I'm making a judgment. Like he's actually naming how he is doing the directions or the step that the prompt asks him to do. Then he rewrites it as a question that would allow him to perform the action that it's asking. And he also gives him a diagram.
Great. And at the end, what's effective about his turn and talk?
They are turning and talking to I think I was writing at the end when he said his turn and talk. What did he ask during the turn and talk? Or what was the prompt for the
He said, okay, turn and talk with your neighbor. What are the strategies I use to deconstruct the prompt?
Okay.
So what's effective about doing that?
That way students can break down the prompt on their own when they're when they've got a prompt in front of
Perfect.
them.
Add that to your notes if you don't have that. If you think back to last year, this is the thing I worked on you with too, asking afterward. Okay, what's the key thing to remember?
And then they internalize it.
Great. So given that you've never explicitly taught how to break down a prompt, I think you need to model first, and you can save these work samples for guided discourse and future do-nows. But I
Okay.
think first they need to have a model on that. So what I want you to do is script out. I can give you a piece of paper. Sorry, I thought I gave you too much paper, turns out I didn't give you enough, so here's a piece of paper. I want you to script out a model you would do for the thinking steps, and I have the 4 thinking steps we talked about this morning, and I think these are pretty kid-friendly for what to do. So deconstruct the question, paraphrase it, that part where you write in the question, review the annotations, and then draft your thesis statement and check to see if it answers the question.
Awesome.
apologizes for everything, but it's my fault. Sorry you made a mistake. That's what she should say. Alright, let me read through it real quick.
So sorry, but it is.
I can read your handwriting now.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I'm like Jeremiah Jackson.
Oh god. I'm worried about that on the AP test actually.
I have been pressuring him, teasing him a little bit, hoping that he doesn't fix his.
Great. I want to see your turn and talk question at the end.
I think we would have to do two. So I think after we break down like the task for writing, I think we'd have to ask them to have them name the steps that went down into breaking down the task for writing, because then they've got to read and annotate the sources to fill out and like be able to respond, and then we'll walk them through choosing a position, listing out their reasons, and checking their thesis with their paraphrased question. Then you ask them like,
That makes sense. So chunking it?
mm-hmm.
Okay. So we'll do the first chunk. Let's take it live.
Right. So first I'm going to, at the beginning, I'm going to model how to break down the prompt we looked at yesterday. You're not worried about breaking down the prompt on your paper, you're worried about, or you're trying to pay attention to my strategies and steps. You're writing them down on your paper so that you can describe them to your neighbor and so that you can do this on a prompt of your own.
Correct.
So first, I'm going to start by deconstructing the prompt by circling keywords about the topic. So as I'm looking at this prompt, it says, with the rising cost of college, many people are exploring apprenticeships as an alternative path for acquiring the skills necessary for future employment. So I am underlining apprenticeships as an alternative path for acquiring the skills necessary for future employment. And I'm jotting off to the side skills to get a job. Individuals entering the workforce must consider the advantages and disadvantages of pursuing these different educational paths. So I'm underlining advantages and disadvantages of pursuing these different educational paths. I'm jotting off to the side by different educational paths, college versus apprenticeship. And then by advantages and disadvantages, I'm writing compare and contrast. So to go back over the topic, I am looking at apprenticeships as an alternative path for getting the skills needed to get a job. And I have to compare the advantages and disadvantages of pursuing college versus an apprenticeship to get these skills. So now I know what the topic is. So I need to now box the verbs to find my task for writing. So I need to figure out what this prompt is actually asking me to do. What kind of argument does it want me to make? How does it want me to examine this topic that I understand now? It says, carefully read sources A through D, including the introductory information for each source. So I'm boxing carefully read sources, because that's the first task I have to do. Compose a thesis statement that addresses the extent to which an apprenticeship is a viable alternative for attending college. So I am boxing address the extent to which an apprenticeship is a viable alternative to attending college. I'm circling viable, and I'm writing off to the side appropriate, or equal or good. So to what extent is an apprenticeship a good alternative to attending college, or a better alternative to attending college? The extent to which is the degree to which. So how much better is it, or how much worse is it?
That's a great thing to emphasize.
Then select at least 3 pieces of evidence from the source to support your position. So I'm circling select at least 3 pieces of evidence and support your position. Because I need to support, it says at least, that means I need more than 3 pieces of evidence if those 3 pieces of evidence do not support it on their own. Then it says briefly explain how each piece of evidence might be used to develop your argument. So I'm boxing briefly explain and develop your argument. And under develop, I'm writing how does each piece of evidence take my argument further and build on itself. So I have to show how those pieces of evidence create a line of reasoning. Then I want to actually paraphrase the prompt in a question that I could actually answer. So, to what do you think I should pause here and have them,
To model, I think you should model how to do it first.
okay.
In a future model, if you're doing this again, you could, but this is the first time you're teaching them how to deconstruct a prompt, so you should tell them.
Okay. So now I want to paraphrase what this prompt is actually asking me to do. So I need to answer the question, to what extent are apprenticeships a better alternative than attending college when it comes to acquiring the skills necessary for future employment? So whatever thesis statement I write has to explain how an apprenticeship is either better than worse than attending college, and to what degree it's better or worse, when it comes to getting the skills I need to get a job. So looking at the skills I need to get a job. So my argument has to be about job-related skills. Now I want to review my annotations on this, or now I want to annotate the sources if I haven't, or review my annotations on the sources to fill out my compare and contrast chart, because I know.
Perfect. I'm gonna have you skip in the interest of time down your turn and talk. What does it sound like?
Now turn and talk with your partner to name the strategies and steps that went into breaking down the task for writing.
Great. How is modeling this going to close the gap that students have, which is they didn't answer the prompt because they didn't know how to deconstruct it?
Students will actually know how to deconstruct the prompts, and they will actually carefully identify all of those key verbs in the topic, and they'll write the correct topic.
Perfect. When are you doing this?
I will do. This is on the calendar for. Is it the date? The week when we come back from break? Because I think this is a lesson that I am supposed to plan.
After break.
Mhm.
Okay, cool.
We'll do
Great. I'm going to come.
Perfect.
I'm going to pause